What if I told you that the most anticipated diplomatic meeting of 2026 just got thrown into chaos? Not because of a trade war, not because of Taiwan, but because of a conflict thousands of miles away in the Middle East that nobody saw coming. Right now, the world is watching as Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are supposed to reset relations between the two most powerful economies on Earth. And yet here we are, with Beijing officially denying what Trump himself announced, calling media reports completely false, while the White House is backtracking, scrambling to explain why the dates may be moved. So what is really going on here? Is this about the Iran war? Is this about the Strait of Hormuz? Or is something much bigger happening behind closed doors that neither side wants you to know about? If you want to understand how this story could reshape global politics, stick around because we are diving deep into the facts, the contradictions, and what this means for all of us. And hey, if you find this valuable, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who needs to understand what is happening in the world right now. Let us get into it. So here is the situation. President Donald Trump was scheduled to travel to Beijing from March 31st to April 2nd for what would have been the first visit by a sitting American president to China since Trump himself went back in 2017 during his first term. This was supposed to be historic. This was supposed to be the moment when the two largest economies finally moved beyond the bruising trade war that saw tariffs explode to triple digits last year. Remember that. Back and forth tariff escalations that threatened to collapse trade between Washington and Beijing entirely. And then came the Busan Truce. In October 2025, Trump and Xi met in South Korea and hammered out a one-year deal. China agreed to buy 25 million metric tons of American soybeans in 2026. They paused their export controls on rare earth minerals. The United States trimmed tariffs on Chinese imports and paused the expansion of blacklists targeting Chinese tech companies. For a moment, it looked like the two superpowers had finally figured out how to coexist without economic warfare. But then February 28th happened. The United States and Israel launched military strikes on Iran. And everything changed. Now, before we get into how this derailed the Trump-Xi summit, let me set the stage. The attack on Iran was massive. Over 90 military targets were hit on Karg Island alone. And in one of the most dramatic moments of modern geopolitics, Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in the strikes. More than 1,300 Iranians have died since the conflict began. And Iran responded with fury. Tehran launched missiles and drones at Israel, at American military bases across the Middle East, and even at Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, and Oman. But the most consequential retaliation was not the missiles. It was what happened in the water. Iran effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you do not know why the Strait of Hormuz matters, let me break it down for you. This narrow waterway connects the Persian Gulf to the world market. 20% of all global oil supply passes through it every single day. We're talking about roughly 20 million barrels of crude oil and massive volumes of liquefied natural gas. When Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced that the strait was closed and that any vessel linked to the United States, Israel, or their allies would be considered a legitimate target, the world economy felt it immediately. Oil prices shot up above $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. At its peak, Brent crude hit $126. Tanker traffic through the strait dropped by 70% almost overnight. Over 150 ships anchored outside the strait to avoid being attacked. And here is where it gets really interesting for our story about Trump and Xi. China receives 45% of its oil imports through the Strait of Hormuz. So you can probably see where this is going. Trump, looking at the crisis in the Middle East, looking at oil prices skyrocketing, looking at the need to rally international support to reopen the strait, started putting pressure on everyone. He called for a naval coalition. He urged China, France, Japan, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and others to send warships to secure the passage. And then came the ultimatum. In an interview with the Financial Times on Sunday, Trump said he might postpone his meeting with Xi Jinping if China did not help unblock the Strait of Hormuz. He specifically said he expected China to step up before he traveled to Beijing for the summit. Now that is a bold move, right? You are essentially telling the leader of China that the price of admission for a presidential summit is military cooperation in the Middle East. And predictably, the reaction was swift. Beijing immediately pushed back. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian addressed the media and stated very clearly that China and the United States are maintaining communication regarding the timing of President Trump's visit and other related issues. But when asked directly about sending Chinese naval vessels to help secure the strait, Beijing said nothing. Complete silence. They refused to address that request at all. And here is where it gets even messier. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who is in Paris meeting with Chinese Vice Premier He Lifeng for high-stakes trade talks, went on CNBC and tried to calm the waters. He said the reports suggesting that Trump delayed the China visit because of the Strait of Hormuz demand were completely false. He insisted that if the meeting was rescheduled, it would be for logistical reasons because the president wanted to stay in Washington to coordinate the war effort. So now we have Trump saying one thing on Sunday, Bessent saying something different on Monday, and Beijing saying the American side has clarified that those reports are false. Are you confused yet? Because honestly, so is everyone else watching this play out. Let us look at what Trump actually said when reporters asked him in the Oval Office on Monday. He said, "I do not know, we are working on that right now. We are speaking to China. I would love to, but because of the war, I want to be here. I have to be here, I feel. And so we have requested that we delay it a month or so." Then on Tuesday, Trump told reporters he would delay his trip for 5 or 6 weeks and that China was fine with it. He added, "We're working with China." They were fine with it. No tricks to it. But wait, if there are no tricks and China is fine with it, why did Beijing feel the need to issue a formal statement denying that the delay has anything to do with the Strait of Hormuz? Why did the Chinese Foreign Ministry specifically say they have noted that the U.S. side has publicly clarified these false reports by the media? The answer is because this is not just about scheduling logistics. This is about saving face. This is about leverage. And this is about both sides trying to control the narrative heading into what was supposed to be the most important bilateral meeting of the year. Let me give you some context on what was at stake. The Paris talks between Bessent and He Lifeng were described by sources as remarkably stable. They discussed potential agricultural deals. China showed openness to additional purchases of American poultry, beef, and non-soybean crops. They talked about rare earth minerals, which China dominates globally and which are essential for everything from jet engines to electric vehicles. They even discussed a managed trade framework to prevent constant tariff escalation threats from paralyzing supply chains. But here is what experts are saying behind closed doors. Preparations for the Trump state visit have been going pretty poorly. That is according to Dominic Chiu, a senior analyst for U.S.-China relations at the Eurasia Group. He told NBC News that from what he understands, China might actually be a little relieved by the delay. Why? Because it gives them more time to figure out how to navigate this incredibly complicated situation. Think about it. The war in Iran puts Beijing in an impossible position. On one hand, Iran is a major oil supplier to China. Chinese purchases account for roughly 90% of Iran's exported oil, providing tens of billions of dollars in annual revenue to Tehran. On the other hand, China has much deeper economic relationships with Iran's Arab rivals, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, both of which have been hit by Iranian missiles since the war began. China registered $108 billion in trade with Saudi Arabia last year, and another $108 billion with the UAE. Compare that to $41 billion with Iran. So when Iranian missiles are striking Saudi oil infrastructure and UAE airports, Beijing has to be very careful about how it responds. And here is the really fascinating part. Despite the chaos in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has actually been allowing its oil to continue flowing to China. Satellite imagery tracked by maritime research firms shows that at least 11.7 million barrels of Iranian crude have passed through the strait since the war began, all of it headed to China. Iranian ships loaded at Chinese ports have even been carrying sodium perchlorate, a key ingredient for solid rocket fuel used in ballistic missiles. So China is walking this incredibly delicate tightrope. They condemn the American and Israeli strikes as violations of international law. They call for immediate ceasefire. But they are also quietly buying Iranian oil and allowing materials that support Iran's military capabilities to flow through their ports. Meanwhile, China has built up massive strategic reserves. As of early January, they had reached approximately 104 days of oil coverage and were projected to reach 140 to 180 days by the end of 2026. That means even if the Strait of Hormuz remained closed for months, China could weather the storm better than almost any other major oil importer. Compare that to Japan, which gets 70% of its oil through the strait, or South Korea and Taiwan, which are significantly exposed to any prolonged disruption. The crisis actually highlights how China's decade-long bet on energy diversification and strategic stockpiling is paying off. Now, let us talk about the broader geopolitical implications here. Some analysts, like Edward Fishman at the Council on Foreign Relations, argue that Beijing is unlikely to comply with Trump's demand to send naval vessels to help reopen the strait. And honestly, why would they? China does not do military alliances as a matter of principle. They have never had a formal defense commitment to Iran, and they are certainly not going to start one with the United States either. But there is another layer to this. A prolonged U.S. military conflict in Iran actually benefits China in certain ways. It keeps American naval assets tied down far from China's borders. It depletes U.S. strategic reserves that might otherwise be deployed in the Pacific. And it gives Beijing a real-time learning opportunity to observe how the United States operates from a naval command perspective. So when Trump threatens to delay the summit unless China helps police the Strait of Hormuz, Beijing can afford to wait him out. They have the reserves. They have the leverage. And frankly, the delay might actually help them prepare better for whatever trade negotiations come next. Here is what I think is really happening. Both sides need this summit, but neither side wants to appear desperate. Trump wants to show strength in the face of the Iran crisis while also delivering a win on trade. He campaigned on being tough on China, and a successful state visit to Beijing would be a major diplomatic achievement. But he also cannot be seen as soft while American forces are fighting in the Middle East. Xi Jinping, for his part, wants to stabilize the economic relationship and avoid re-escalation of the trade war. But he cannot be seen as caving to American pressure, especially not when that pressure involves military demands in the Middle East. China's state media has been very clear that in a moment like this, the last thing the world needs is a trade war between its two largest economies. So what happens next? The most likely scenario is that the summit gets pushed back by about a month, maybe 5 or 6 weeks, as Trump suggested. Both sides will claim it was a mutual decision based on logistics and the president's command responsibilities during wartime. The Strait of Hormuz issue will quietly fade from the public narrative, even though it was clearly a factor. The Paris talks have already laid the groundwork for potential deliverables. We could see announcements on increased Chinese purchases of American agricultural products, possible agreements on rare earth mineral supplies, and maybe even some movement on Boeing aircraft orders. China desperately needs to keep its aviation industry supplied, and American farmers desperately need export markets. But here is the wild card. If the Iran conflict drags on for months and oil prices stay elevated, the entire global economy suffers. Goldman economists have already raised their recession odds to 25%. Oxford Economics modeled a scenario where oil at $140 per barrel for 2 months would be enough to push the Eurozone, the United Kingdom, and Japan into economic contraction. At that point, the Trump-Xi summit becomes less about resetting relations and more about crisis management. Both the United States and China would have enormous incentives to stabilize energy markets, which could actually lead to unexpected cooperation. Or it could go the other way. Trump has already warned that he might hit Iranian oil infrastructure just for fun, as he told NBC News. If the U.S. escalates further and damages Iran's export capabilities at Kharg Island, Tehran has promised severe retaliation. That could mean more attacks on shipping, more attacks on Gulf state infrastructure, and potentially a conflict spiral that neither Washington nor Beijing can control. What we are witnessing right now is a perfect storm of geopolitical forces colliding. Trade negotiations that have taken years to stabilize are suddenly caught up in a military conflict that nobody planned for. Two superpowers that need each other economically are finding themselves on opposite sides of a war that has nothing to do with their core disputes. And at the center of it all, a summit that was supposed to deliver certainty is instead delivering confusion, contradictions, and competing narratives about what is really going on. So here's my take. Do not get distracted by the back and forth about whether the delay is linked to the Strait of Hormuz or not. Both sides have incentives to deny that connection publicly while privately understanding that everything is connected. The Iran war has changed the calculus for American foreign policy. It has changed the calculus for China's energy security. And it has changed the timeline for what might have been the most important bilateral meeting of the year. The question is not whether Trump and Xi will eventually meet. They will. The question is what the world will look like when they do. Will the Strait of Hormuz be open? Will oil be back to $60 a barrel or stuck at $120? Will the trade truce hold, or will new tariff threats emerge? And most importantly, will this summit actually deliver lasting stability, or just another temporary pause in an ongoing rivalry that shows no signs of ending? These are the questions we should be asking. These are the stakes we should be paying attention to. And that brings us to the end of today's deep dive. If you found this valuable, if you learned something new, if you want to stay informed about what is really happening in the world rather than just the surface-level headlines, then do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. Tap the notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a like on this video because it helps the algorithm share this content with more people who need to hear it. And if you know someone who is trying to understand what is going on with the United States, China, and this whole geopolitical mess, share this video with them. We are living through historic times, folks. The decisions being made right now in Washington, Beijing, and Tehran will shape the world for decades to come. Stay informed, stay curious, and I will see you in the next one.